BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays this year I've been talking to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And in this episode, I will be looking at the Jack the Ripper suspect, Edgar Degas. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who operated in England in 1888, and whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. Earlier this year, several people contacted me, and they asked me what I thought about some videos that were going viral on TikTok, where someone was accusing the French painter Edgar Degas of being Jack the Ripper. And my immediate response was, I don't care what some TikToker thinks about this if they're going to accuse a French impressionist painter, or realist painter as he preferred to be called, of being Jack the Ripper, and I just simply closed the door on it. However, I had to break that rule of ignoring TikTokers, because I also do a segment here on Black Box Online Radio called the Zodiac Killer News Report, which comes out on Mondays, Zodiac Monday, and someone made an even larger splash in the world of Zodiac news, and his name is J-Foy, and he went viral for accusing his grandfather Richard Hoffman of being the Zodiac Killer. Although a big difference is, I think a fair way of putting it is, J-Foy took existing material that was on the internet, and he looked at a widely discussed theory involving Richard Hoffman being the Zodiac Killer, and he simply presented it in his own way. Whereas this theory involving Edgar Degas appears to be rather original. And firstly, I found them on YouTube. They were re-uploaded under the name Kiki Sure. The full name of the channel is Kiki Sure Genius Unsolved. I'm not sure if Kiki Sure is her legal name or if that's a stage name, but that is the source for this on YouTube. I really don't do a lot with TikTok. I have a TikTok page, blackboxonlineradio, and I use it to upload my YouTube shorts, which come out Monday through Friday here on this channel. But other than that, I'm not very involved on TikTok. And as I said, I dismissed this very early on, and perhaps I was a little bit too dismissive, because in all fairness, I think that Kiki Sure has raised some strong points about Edgar Degas being Jack the Ripper, and there are also points that I would like to challenge. And I'm going to play a clip from her in just a second where she can introduce her Jack the Ripper theory in her own words, and then we can respond to it. However, I also want to remind you guys that I used to do a segment on Ripper Wednesday called the Jack the Ripper Report, where it was a compilation of different stories about Jack the Ripper, all encapsulated within a single episode. There is a playlist for the Jack the Ripper reports, but I would like to do this episode in somewhat of a similar fashion, and I'm going to be responding to two other articles that are covering different pieces of Jack the Ripper material, so stick around until the end, please. And right now, let's have Kiki Sure introduce her theory in her own words.
My Roman Empire is the fact that I think that Edgar Degas, painter of ballerinas, was Jack the Ripper. Hear me out. We all know that Jack the Ripper killed women, specifically ones that he probably mistook for women of the night. At the time of the murders, Edgar Degas was in his early 50s and was beginning to really hate women. He'd always been a bit of a misogynist, but he was degrading into a horrible, awful misanthrope of a person that people did not want to be around. And part of that was that he was going blind. With modern technology, we know that most psychopaths and all serial killers have a dead spot in their brain right behind their eyes. And Degas had Stargardt's disease, we believe, because he had a hereditary disease that caused blindness over time. In Stargardt's disease, the area behind the eyes, the orbital frontocortex, occipital lobe area, can go black. No gray matter activity in that region when the loss of visual input causes decay. So I believe that over time he gradually became a worse and worse person because his ability to make good decisions was just being destroyed. This does not happen with everyone who has Stargardt's, by the way, but he was already a pretty shitty human being. He was also wealthy, well-connected, and he lived in Paris, which was just a short train ride away from London where the murders occurred. A year later, his friend Whistler of Whistler's mother chided him for not coming for lunch any longer. Whistler lived in London. Apparently Degas was fond of just taking a train in, having lunch with Whistler, and going home. Degas took a 2-week trip down to southern France for 2 of the murders, and during that time he sent a ton of letters to all his most famous friends, and friends he'd never before written to, as far as we know. The only letter that they ever wrote that we have to this day is the letter that he wrote during the murders. So I have to wonder if he was setting himself up an alibi, because why did he write to all of these society gossips, these long, pages-long letters that are full of witticisms and quips that he hoped that they would share about things that were scheduled in advance, like plays? If you look at the number of letters he wrote during that 2 to 3 week span, it's more than most years in the 5 years after and the 5 years before. We also wonder if Jack the Ripper was a surgeon, because he removed several organs and knew where they were and where to cut in the neck in order to cause death, because he had a good grasp on anatomy. But other people questioned whether he could be a surgeon because he had an unsteady hand and didn't cut like a surgeon. He just knew where everything was. Well, Degas was a classically trained artist. He had attended human dissections, probably multiple times. He was also obsessive about knowing every detail about how a body worked, and he called women similar to horses, like animals, like things that he wanted to know every motion of. And so the fact that Jack the Ripper dissected Mary Jane Kelly does not surprise me in the least. Because who would have wanted to spend multiple hours dissecting a body other than Degas? And the fact that they think that Jack the Ripper spent a few hours there, at the very least 2 hours, but not very much longer, does not surprise me either, because the interest that Degas would have in the body after rigor mortis set in would be nil. And rigor mortis begins to set in after 2 hours. So once the corpse started showing signs of not behaving normally, he was out. Dark as that is. The third and the fourth murders of the 5 canonical Jack the Ripper victims were done on the same night, and they seem to be trying to be pinned on Jewish people for whatever reason. There's an interesting thing you should look up if you're not familiar with it, called the Golston Street Graffito, which was written on a wall and above the apron of one of the victims. And in chalk, the man we think of as Jack the Ripper wrote, "The Jews are the men who will not be blamed for nothing," which is not an English grammatical pattern, and he wrote Jews in a way that no English speaker would spell it. And he wrote it in chalk, and Degas was a pastel artist who would likely have carried chalk on him at all times. Further, Edgar Degas was a notorious anti-Semite. He hated Jewish people, and that would become eminently clear only a few years later during the Dreyfus affairs, where he loudly and proudly spoke out against yes, he was a bad guy in general. Also, Degas' obsession with painting ballerinas and women who were not watching, and his weird voyeurism in his subject matters, is not surprising if you compare it to Jack the Ripper's MO, because Jack the Ripper targeted women and thought very little of them. Look at Degas' art. He's painting ballerinas. Ballerinas were very commonly prostitutes. And the way that he painted them, with the dark shadows in the background of the men trying to arrange a tryst with them later that night. Look at how many of his paintings are all about that woman's body and have no face. Look at all of his pastels, where the darkest line on the woman is the line cut across her neck of a ribbon tied around there. Look at his technical masterpiece of a work, which is called Interior, but is colloquially known amongst art historians as Le Viol, which means the rape. Jack the Ripper did not SA his women. He just killed them. He had no interest in them in that way, and neither did Edgar Degas. He wanted to know their inner workings. He did not like them. But other than that, he had no interest in them.
And one more time, that was available on the YouTube channel Kiki Sure Genius Unsolved. So she has shared a lot of things about Edgar Degas that are somewhat in line with Jack the Ripper and somewhat without. And firstly, I want to address the strong points that she has, and a lot of her theory relates to the interpretations of the artwork. Edgar Degas was an Impressionist painter, but even on his own Wikipedia page, it states that he did not want to be known as an Impressionist painter. He thought of himself as a realist. He was somebody who would like to depict women in various different lights, particularly painting ballerinas, and when he would paint the ballerinas, they often would have a dark mark around the neck. Sometimes it looks like a black collar, sometimes it's very clearly a shadow, based on the way that it's painted, and he also has men who are lurking, dark, ominous figures in the background, almost stalking their prey, and there's even one that's called Interior, that features a man sneaking up behind a woman in her bedroom, or at the very least, he is looking down upon the woman in her bedroom. Based on the context, we can't tell exactly how he got there, but at the same time, if he is a reported misogynist, all of this does match up somewhat with the way that Jack the Ripper would be stalking women and would be obsessed with women in a certain way, even though he didn't think very highly of them. And lots of people believe that Jack the Ripper was indeed a misogynist. The second strong point is that Edgar Degas was an anti-Semite. Again, if you just get on his Wikipedia page, you will see at the bottom it states that up until his death in 1917, that he died an outspoken anti-Semite. And after Jack the Ripper's third night of activity, the double event, which saw the deaths of Catherine Eddowes and Liz Stride, irrespectively. Liz Stride was murdered first, and then Catherine Eddowes was murdered second. There was a message that was found written on a building that said something to the effect of, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," which Kiki sure states as an anti-Semitic statement. And this is one point, though, that I think is a very original thing that I haven't heard from anybody else. Maybe it's been listed before, but what Kiki has stated is that this is written with a double negative, almost the way that a French speaker would write the English language, and it also misspells the word Jews, Juews, or maybe it was written in a different way. Again, the Goulston Street graffito was not photographed because Sir Charles Warren ordered it erased before they could photograph it. So the exact misspellings or the exact text of the Goulston Street graffito has been lost to time. But it says the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. And in the French language, they frequently use the double negatives. Like if you want to say, I know nothing, you would say, je ne sais rien. And Jerome from the French Wrecking Crew, Mysteries with Mr. Belgique, if you listen to this episode, sorry you have to hear my horrible pronunciation. And it's my understanding that the English language did this for years until a mathematician actually approached a linguistic council and talked about how, if something has a double negative, it actually equals a positive. That if you say that the Jews are not the men that will be blamed for nothing, that means that, well, then they're going to be blamed for something. So, I mean, that's just one statement that could be written by someone who was not a native English speaker and maybe a French speaker. She also states that Edgar Degas was someone who was a wealthy, well-connected individual. He is somebody who could have used these connections and, as well as his fame, for interacting with people, getting out of trouble if he were ever caught. He could write off these particular connections that he had established, someone who was not afraid of the law, partnered with the fact that Edgar Degas was experiencing a lot of mental health issues in his life. Particularly, he had an issue involving the occipital lobe in his brain, as well as some type of neurological deterioration. And, I mean, I also have to give credit to Kiki, sure. She has followed the writings of James H. Fallon, who is the author of The Psychopath Inside. He's a professor at UC Irvine and a researcher. I first learned about Dr. James H. Fallon and his book back in 2020, and I've talked about him a lot here on Black Box Online Radio. Although I confess that it appeared that Kiki seemed to struggle a little bit with the material, and she talks about stuff, again citing James H. Fallon by her own admission, that there's a part of the brain called the orbitofrontal cortex, which is mostly right behind the eyes, and this part of the brain can deal with certain type of irregularities that would drive people to develop homicidal urges, for lack of a better term. And you can think of it this way. I once heard the life coach Michael Buckley in one of his YouTube videos say, that part of your brain, right behind your eyes, only thinks about food and sex. And no, that's not 100% true, but you can get the idea. And more or less, what James H. Fallon likes to talk about is that serial killers frequently have an irregularity between the orbitofrontal cortex, which is part of the frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex, going to the amygdala in the brain. And this is the stuff that I thought was really left out from Kiki Scher's presentations. And the amygdala is the part of the brain that deals with the regulation of emotion. So people are acting on urges and they aren't feeling emotional connections. And this includes acting on these urges against other people. Now, in one of her videos, maybe her most famous video, she states that the orbitofrontal cortex is then right next to the occipital lobe in the brain, where Edgar Degas would have had his neurological issues. And I don't believe that that's right at all. The occipital lobe is in the back of the brain, and you can think about it this way. There's frontal, parietal, occipital. The parietal lobe would be in the middle. Of course, the temporal lobe is on the side, but frontal, parietal, occipital, it goes in alphabetical order, F, P, O. And I had a teacher back in high school who was talking about either her mother or her grandmother, but what happened is that her mother or grandmother developed this type of condition where she could only see in tunnel vision. All of the surroundings were black except for two very, very small circles that she could just see. It's almost as if you were just wearing some type of blinders and you could only see through very, very small holes that were on like some type of blacked out goggles or something like that. And they thought that she had a problem with her eyes, but it was actually a problem with the occipital lobe in the brain. So I do completely understand what she's saying. The occipital lobe is going to go through the other parts of the brain. It's going to have all types of neurological messages that are sent straight across the brain, more or less. So, again, I see what she is saying there. Now, she also believes that Edgar Degas would have had some type of mental deterioration that would have driven him to kill, where he hates Jews, he hates women, he's going to go after them. He also thinks that he is somewhat of a powerful individual, he has powerful connections, he's not going to be afraid of anyone, sure. But what were his whereabouts at the time? As we've said very clearly, Edgar Degas, who was born Hilaire Germain Edgar Degas, and he changed his name to Degas because it was, I guess, less hoity-toity or something. I saw that in one of the videos, and he wanted to use that pronunciation of his name as well as the spelling. But as far as his whereabouts, he was reported to have been in France at the time, but firstly, she states that he was not in Paris where he was known to live. Instead, he went to the Southern Alps during 1888, and he was supposedly at a type of retreat in a very small town in the Alps, and he mailed multiple letters from there. But the theory that Kiki was establishing is that it appears that he was doing this and by having somebody else mail these letters for him, because random people started receiving letters from Edgar Degas, and it would be the only letter that he had received from them. And when I say random, I mean they are not very close personal connections, people who were not necessarily receiving letters regularly from him. So she's saying that it seems like almost he wrote these letters ahead of time, and he wanted them mailed at specific times to give himself an alibi when he was committing the murders. Also, Edgar Degas kept a very, very close and intense personal journal that stopped before 1888. So that is something else that would indicate that, he has moved on to a different type of mental state, so on. But, let's talk about some of the challenges associated with Kiki Scher's theory that the French painter Edgar Degas was Jack the Ripper. Number 1. Edgar Degas was born in 1834, and in several of her videos, Kiki Scher states that he was just over 50 years old at the time of the Whitechapel murders. But as I said at the beginning, if Jack the Ripper is operating in 1888, I'm going to do some fast math and estimate that he was 54 years old. He was born on July 19th of 1834, so he would indeed be 54 years old. I think that that is very old for a Jack the Ripper suspect, because he is somebody... Jack the Ripper is reported to have been in his 30s from the few witness statements that we have. The psychological profiles estimate we're dealing with somebody much closer to 30 than 54 years old, but I suppose that anything is possible. Also, her observations about how the Goulston Street graffito, the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing, that is an anti-Semitic statement, Well, that is only one interpretation of the evidence. There are other interpretations that are out there. One of them is that the Ripper was indeed Jewish himself, and that message doesn't mean I hate Jews. It means that Jews are being unfairly treated, or that they are just going to be experiencing unfair and unjust behaviors. I think that that might be the best way of putting it, that there is an injustice that is being committed against Jewish people in England. I mean, it's interpretive because, number one, there are misspellings. Number two, the grammar isn't perfect. And here's another issue. Just because there are mistakes and just because it uses this type of double negative, which I confess, I didn't even hear from her talking about the French grammatical structures. She states by her own admission that she does not speak French. I was giving her that as something charitable. But even if there are misspellings and grammatical mistakes, that doesn't mean that it was written by a French speaker. There are multiple Jack the Ripper suspects that have come from other countries, whether it's Russia or Poland or Germany, and, English would also not be their first language. So I don't see enough evidence to state that the Goulston Street graffito is even referring to something that is definitively anti-Semitic, or that it was certainly written by a French person. With the Goulston Street graffito, let's go through three possibilities that exist. Number one, it was written by Jack the Ripper because he wanted the Jews to be blamed for it. That's more or less what Kiki sure has stated in her theory involving Edgar Degas. Number two, it was written by Jack the Ripper because he was Jewish. And, he's talking about the injustice against Jews. Number three, it was not written by the Ripper at all, because this doesn't talk about anything in relation to the Ripper's crimes. And some of you guys were talking about this in the comment section last week on Ripper Wednesday. And, again, you can always hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. You can also go through some of the links in the description box. One is for buymeacoffee.com, which allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. Anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And you can always download the show for free on Spotify, and you can visit the Facebook fan page called Not Ray Johnson for Black Box Online Radio, and that is available on Instagram. But as far as what you guys were saying in the comment section, the actions that Jack the Ripper was performing aren't connected to anything in the Goulston Street graffito. Jack the Ripper is targeting women who don't seem to have any connection to the Jewish faith, and he is just targeting women who are apparently and seemingly available on the street. Now, we don't necessarily know what the Ripper was thinking when he wrote that. And the final possibility is that that is just a purely unrelated message that was written by somebody else. It was a graffito that was written and inscribed by someone who had nothing to do with the Ripper case. For the longest time, that's what I thought. For the longest time, I thought that, they found this message on the building, then that was just most likely completely unrelated, and just because there's a chalk message that's put out there, it doesn't mean that it was written by the Ripper. But what I learned since then, and what other people have persuaded me to believe, is that yes, indeed, that was written by the Ripper, because that was not reported by any witness as being there previously, and it's not just simply people who are going about their evening. There were police officers from the London Metropolitan Police that are going up and down the streets on their beat, and they didn't report seeing anything on Goulston Street. They didn't report the graffito previously. Therefore, that leads me to believe that, okay, this was written by the Ripper. I mean, the reason why they think it was written by the Ripper is because the apron that was owned by Catherine Eddowes, the fourth victim, was dropped relatively close to the place where the Goulston Street graffito was written. Now, here's one point, though, that I have to challenge very strongly, and I haven't mentioned it yet. And she states, by she, I mean Kiki sure states in her videos, that Edgar Degas was a pastel painter, and the Goulston Street graffito was written in chalk. And he would have been the type of person to carry chalk. I don't like this type of thinking. I don't like this type of mental rearranging, because we get this a lot in other true crime cases. I talk about the Zodiac Killer and D.B. Cooper here on Black Box Online Radio, and we see this all the time when people are just making some sort of very simple connection between their suspect and the crimes that would apply to millions of other people. How many other people in London would have had access to the chalk? I mean, was Edgar Degas even in London? I would actually turn to somebody else. There's a YouTube channel out there called The Pub Test that is run by a guy named Owen, and he was responding to Kiki Scher's claims that Edgar Degas was Jack the Ripper, but interestingly, he did not watch any of the TikTok videos. I've even played them here in this episode, but instead, what he chose to do was he wanted to just independently look at Edgar Degas as a Jack the Ripper suspect without hearing any of her claims. Well, is there something that is going to confirm or deny him as Jack the Ripper? And the area that he zoned in the most on was that Edgar Degas' alibi of being in southern France at a type of retreat, and he did seem to be aware that Kiki Scher had claimed that Edgar Degas may have paid somebody to mail the letters for him, and they were written ahead of time, and he's more or less just saying assumption, assumption, assumption. It seems like, again, and this is more or less a direct quotation from him, that we didn't have phones, we didn't have YouTube back in 1888, we didn't have the internet. So what would somebody do to pass the time during a retreat? They would write letters. So it doesn't seem out of the ordinary that somebody would receive a letter from Edgar Degas when they wouldn't receive them normally. It would be the only letter that he ever wrote to them. Well, if he's just in the Alps passing the time, then he is going to be somebody who is going to be doing things like writing letters. So I went into this suspect exploration with a lot of pessimism, as you can see, but I do think that Kiki has raised some strong points, which I've gone over here. Although, I do have to confess, she starts out by saying that her Roman Empire is labeling Edgar Degas as Jack the Ripper, and I just have to simply point out that the Roman Empire is dead and has been dead for a long time. Maybe not the best choice. But I told you guys that I would move on to another subject here on Ripper Wednesday, and this relates to something that happened recently. A couple nights ago, I was in a restaurant. I was out for dinner with my fiance, and she was on her phone just looking at Facebook, and she's like, "Hey, look!" She hands me her phone, and there was an article from Lad Bible that was talking about how the Jack the Ripper case has been solved. A DNA link has been connected to another suspect. And before I even read the article, I was just thinking, is this Aaron Kosminski? And I read through the article from Lad Bible, and yes, indeed, they were talking about Aaron Kosminski and the DNA link. And then, as I was going through this, I was going to think, is this about Russell Edwards' book, naming the Ripper, naming Jack the Ripper? And yes, indeed, it was. And then I proceeded to go on a 5 to 10 minute rant in front of my fiance talking about how this book has been out for years. Back in 2014, when I was a writer for an entertainment website, one of my final assignments was writing a preview for the book that was written by Russell Edwards, talking about how there could be this DNA link between Jack the Ripper and a shawl that was owned by Catherine Eddowes, and it could have DNA that was from Aaron Kosminski. So she was bored out of her mind, and she did not like hearing that at all. Maybe I shouldn't have done that, maybe I should have, but the whole point is, this is old news if you see this stuff going around. And also, I did a YouTube short once when I was talking about how if the evidence was extremely credible, I don't think that everybody would be downplaying it. And I mean, let's be clear, it's mitochondrial DNA, so that doesn't confirm a suspect. It can only be used to eliminate a suspect, but tens of thousands of people in London could have had the same mitochondrial DNA. That does not mean that it was Aaron Kosminski. And I'm going to have to do a larger presentation on Russell Edwards' book and just the DNA in the future, because I can tell that you guys on who listen to Ripper Wednesday really like hearing about the forensics and the hard facts and all the analyses that people are doing, the attempts to actually solve the case. And this stuff with Edgar Degas mostly relates on interpretations of the artwork, as well as interpretations of the suspect profile, looking at characteristics of this person, looking at the activities of his life, and that is a lot easier to do than to talk about the forensics, and nothing against Kiki Scher for that. She seems that she has connected some dots in her own way, but at the same time, I think that it's maybe not the most beneficial discussion. But I told you guys that I had something else for you here on Ripper Wednesday, and over on JackTheRipperTour.com, there's an article that is written by Richard Jones, and I'm a big and close follower of Richard Jones and everything he puts out on Jack the Ripper tour. He is the author of The London of Jack the Ripper, and I have a two-part book discussion about that here on Black Box Online Radio. I've also had the opportunity to interview Richard Jones, and my interview with him is here as well. Lots of content about Jack the Ripper that you guys can follow. But he wrote an article called Why I Hate Ripperology, and I'm going to end this episode with a challenge question for you guys, and you can be very honest. What do you think about this? Should people call themselves ripperologists? One more time, the article is Why I Hate Ripperology by Richard Jones. Let me be honest here. I abhor the titles ripperology and ripperologist, although I enjoy the company of and greatly admire individual ripperologists. Why? Quite simply because they are non-terms invented by people who study or studied the subject of the Whitechapel murders and wanted to make their studies sound grand and important. Ripperology, a made-up subject. It reminds me of the old Maureen Lipman BT adverts where her grandson Anthony tells her that he failed all of his exams except for pottery and sociology. Her character responds, he gets an ology and he says he's failed. You get an ology and you say you're a scientist. Ripperology, the battle of history. The advert was mocking the pretentious aspirations of the education system in the 1980s, and the fact that so many subjects had ology tacked onto them to make them sound impressive and important. In fact, in the majority of cases, it meant absolutely nothing. It was around this time that the terms ripperologist and ripperology began to creep into the lexicon of true crime studies, having been coined, I believe, by the late Colin Wilson, 1931 to 2013, as those who studied the Jack the Ripper atrocities saw an opportunity to legitimize their interest. Nowadays, the publishing world, the internet, and even Facebook are filled with ripperologists who have found themselves trapped in a sort of existential world of self-proclaimed expertise or specialism. My name's Richard, and I'm a ripperologist. You can imagine spouting as your fellow self-ordained ripper buffs nod in recognition. Hi, Richard. What is a ripperologist? But ripperology per se simply doesn't exist. In fact, that well-known expert on what does or doesn't exist, a word or subject, my spell check, is, as I type this, underlining it in red, although I will concede that it recognizes ripperologist, but not ripperologist plural. Go figure that one. And let's expand upon this. We don't talk about someone who studies Charles Dickens as a Dickensologist, or someone who studies Shakespeare as a Shakespeareologist, so why do we have this need to have an attempt to legitimize the study of the Jack the Ripper crimes with a term that is in fact as fictional as the name from which it is derived? More harm than good. I would suggest that the use of the term actually reinforces a stereotype of those who study the case that has crept in recent years as lone keyboard warriors trading insults from their mother's cellar or basement. And yet, I can speak from a great deal of experience, having over the years met some wonderful and very social Whitechapel murder historians. The majority of those who study the case are anything but keyboard warriors. They are friendly, caring people and are pleasant to hold conversations with. Yes, there are a few fanatics in the field who are probably hammering the keyboard in their mother's basements as they call anyone who doesn't agree with their particular suspect all the names under the sun. But they are very much in the minority. Is it time to abandon ripperology? Ripperologist and ripperology are so 1980s. What's wrong with being a historian, true crime historian, or crime historian, or even a social historian? I must confess that I wince when anyone introduces me as a ripperologist, as I absolutely despise the term, and think that it cheapens serious study. Am I the only one who feels that way? And once again, this article is written by Richard Jones, published in 2021. It's called Why I Hate Ripperology on the Jack the Ripper Tour website. What is your response to that? Firstly, I absolutely do not call myself a ripperologist. It would be unfair if I did. Yes, I do this Ripper Wednesday segment here on Black Box Online Radio, but I did my first episode about Jack the Ripper in 2019, and that was 5 years ago. However, I have not been studying the Ripper case for the entirety of those 5 years. Instead, I've really only put about 2 years of serious study and focus on the Whitechapel murders. Therefore, it would be purely inappropriate of somebody at my level to call myself a ripperologist, and I also would not have a need to do that. And there are some people who might fit into the category of ripperologists that do exactly what Richard Jones just said. I was watching a documentary that featured Donald Rumbelow, and he was presented as a British crime historian. So, my honest take on the subject is, if somebody wants to call themselves a ripperologist, I have no problem with that. And I think that we might see other names that are coming out more frequently. We even have the term zodiologist that's used for people who study the Zodiac killer mystery. Maybe one day there'll be a Cooperologist for D.B. Cooper if there isn't already. I don't really have a problem with it, and it's not necessarily that I'm disagreeing with Richard Jones. I mean, the only part that I might be disagreeing with is that I don't think it cheapens serious study. If anything, it just means that people have a big focus on a certain aspect of British history. What I noticed that is quite different between Jack the Ripper and some of the other cases that I follow here on Black Box Online Radio is ripperologists are the real deal. They are serious historians who get well beyond just the concept of, well, who was the killer? Who was the perpetrator? Let's unmask this individual known as Jack the Ripper. No, these are people that are just studying all dynamics of Victorian England. And if somebody wants to call themselves a ripperologist, I have no problem. I don't call myself a ripperologist because I don't think it would be appropriate for me, but I don't think I ever will. However, I also, have no real issue with anybody using that title. Do you agree or disagree with anything that was listed in that article? Do you agree with the statement that I made that ripperology does not cheapen serious study? It just means you're focusing on the Jack the Ripper case. Now, I might concede that the term historian would be a little bit more accepted in academic circles than ripperologist, but at the same time, to people like us who are following the Ripper case regularly, to people like you guys who are tuning in to Ripper Wednesday every week, would you say that ripperology cheapens serious study? I wouldn't, but that's just me. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Black Box Online Radio, talking about Edgar Degas, talking about the Jack the Ripper DNA and ripperology. Let me know what you think about Edgar Degas, Jack the Ripper suspect. Let me know what you think about the forensics in the Jack the Ripper case, and of course responding to those challenge questions. I am your host, Black Box Nid. Thank you so much for listening. And you can always get the show on Facebook. I have a Black Box Online Radio Facebook page, as well as my personal Facebook. My name is Ned Dahan. You can also get the show on Instagram and TikTok under the names BlackBoxNid88, even though I don't do a lot on TikTok over there. And of course, you can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. And I will see you guys on Friday talking about D.B. Cooper. Until next time.